what's left now. They might have left like a small section just for like to remind people what it looked like or something, but the rest of it's all gone. And it's like, he gave this and he says, if you people just stay out of the greater Russia, which included Ukraine, if you guys stay out of, these are all your countries back. They got a whole bunch of countries. They got the Eastern Bloc back. And he gave this all to them. This is a goodwill gesture of epic proportion. And he said, just stay out of it. And I think they agreed to this. I mean, look this stuff up. I don't know the dates, but they agreed to stay out. And, well, where are they today? And they went in there, the CIA went in there, and they manipulated the election so Zelensky would get in. They trapped Russians in buildings and burned the buildings down. They took HIMARS and shot at Russians, which are 90% of these regions in the bordering area. And they were shooting at them with HIMARS, which are made in the United States. And they're a pretty powerful weapon. They're basically a bombing. You're shooting bombs. They were killing Russian civilians this way, and they were lighting buildings. They lit a building on fire with Russians in it in Odessa. I mean, this is genocide, is what it is. They took their rights away. They said, you can't speak Russian, and this is a 90% Russian area. Only 10% other nationalities. You went into cities that are 90% Russian, and they says you can't speak Russian, you can't go to the Russian Orthodox Church, you got to join the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They were taking basic fundamental rights away from the Russians, and they wondered why there was trouble. And then they manipulated the election, and here the West had agreed to stay out of this area. So we broke the treaty. And they wanted to break up Russia because they could not compete with a strong, they didn't want to have someone that they couldn't predict what they were going to do. And if you look back in 1917, who paid for the Bolshevik Revolution? That was paid for by the West. Big bankers paid for that. And that's a little bit of conspiracy theory, but I actually looked it up, and it can be verified. There's evidence for it. There's even Senate documents, and I mean, you can follow the money. They were selling red bonds in New York City. And they did the same thing with China. They did a better job with China, though. They made it so they could sell their products to us. That's why everything's made in China. So I think there's something really dark going on there. It's kind of creepy, but it's actually verifiable. And Cryon said, yeah, this kind of stuff is true. He says, yeah, there are people that do things like this. He didn't specifically mention instances. Yeah, there are people that are doing things like this that are hidden. He says, yes, this stuff's going on, and it's going on now, and it's been going on for a long time. He says, but you can't really, he says, don't get too involved with trying to convince people of it, because you're just going to make them think you're weird. And so, he says, yeah, it's true. This stuff's true, but you don't want to be spinning this. And he used the word spinning. He says, don't spin this all the time, because you're not going to convince anybody of it. People are just going to think you're weird. I did look this stuff up. It's verifiable, though. And Cryon says, yeah, it's real. But he more or less says, find something else to promote.